Hello there. Welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, journeying together into deep discipleship. I'm Brian Fisher, and I'm joined by Dr. Tim and Handsome Kyle. And this is episode 113. This is a greenhouse episode, and we are greenhousing. Yes, we've turned that noun into a verb. Episode 112, which asks the question, where are our deeply formative communities in modern Christianity? So I'll tee this up a little bit, guys, and then we'll turn it over to you. I should just make an announcement for our audience. If you're listening to this in real time, we're 2.5 years into the podcast. It's coming up on Thanksgiving here in the United States and the Christmas season. So we will be taking a break here as we finish up season 5 and plan on picking back up after the new year. So if you're wondering, hey, where are all the December episodes of Soil and Roots? We're going to be eating and socializing and celebrating Jesus's birth between Thanksgiving and Christmas, and we'll see you after the new year. If you're not listening to us in real time, then you can ignore that. Also, if you're interested in following us on social media, we're most active on Substack. If you don't know what that is, it's a social media platform primarily for writers and longer form content or people that enjoy that. And it's exploding. It's not that old, but it continues to attract writers and thinkers. And so I do typically a weekly column over there, and you could just find it at Soil and Roots. But I've been exploring the Great Omission, the 3 primary problems, all of the things that we've been exploring for the last 3 years, 2.5 years, from some different angles. And so if you're more curious about those aspects of our spiritual formation, then I invite you to go over to Substack. We're on Facebook, we're on YouTube, we're on Instagram, and obviously this podcast is found on all sorts of different platforms. We always love to hear from you, so fish@soilandroots.org is still our email address. Yes, it's a mixed metaphor, but we like paradoxes here at Soil and Roots, so there you go. All right, guys, so I was closing this season by asking some critical questions that I've asked of myself. We've spent 2.5 years exploring the fact that modern Christianity tends towards, I'm not sure how else to put it, a shallow shadow of itself, meaning it's not that good service isn't happening or good ministry or that the church isn't growing or being effective, but that it does lack depth. And this has been an observation of theologians and thinkers for well over 50 years, so I'm not alone in that. But I found myself asking the question, if the modern spiritual formation movement, which is the effort to encourage us to explore the abundant life, to expect and assume contentment regardless of our circumstances, to focus on loving like Jesus as the prime centrality of the Christian life, if that doesn't describe modern Christianity on the whole, how do we get there? And if this message has been taught and disseminated for 50 years, where are the churches or even the small communities that are focusing on what we would consider to be genuine discipleship, spiritual formation, becoming more like Jesus, acting, thinking, loving, listening more like our King? And, the episode asked a lot of questions that, to be honest, I'm struggling to answer, which is why we're doing the greenhouse episode. So I'll turn this over to Tim. But my primary challenge is, on one hand, trying to honor and respect and love institutional churches, and I do. At the same time, taking an authentic look at them and saying, well, look, we should deal with reality as it presents itself versus romantic notions about what we think is happening at church. If we're going to define the church as a place we go once a week for corporate worship and to hear a message and to hear some good music, great. If we define a church as a group of people coming together to be intentionally formed more like Jesus, then I think that's a question that we need to really wrestle with. So, Tim, I'll turn it over to you.
Sounds good. So before we circle back in a little bit to examining this question of whether this kind of formative community is happening in our churches as we experience them, I thought it'd be helpful to dig a little bit into what we mean by deep community at all. So the first part of that is of course the word deep, which you've explored quite a bit. You've defined it, Brian, as being increasingly attuned to God's heart, our own hearts, to the hearts of others, and even to creation and culture, which was interesting to me because normally we would think of deep as opposed to shallow, as being beyond surface level, beyond simple, dissatisfied with shallowness. That is, it's almost like a qualitative assessment. Depth in this sense implies gradations, right? But you seem to be reframing depth to be more about where we have applied our focus, that we become deep people through a focus on becoming like Jesus, which means being attuned to his heart, ours, and others. Is that fair?
Yeah. I think I'm trying to throw a question out there for discussion because I think we normally consider deep to be the same as knowledgeable. And I have come to the conclusion that those two things are not always the same. And as a matter of fact, sometimes they're not the same at all. So if an emotionally, relationally, spiritually deep person is somebody who simply knows a lot, theological systems, a lot about the Bible or religion in general, I actually think that tends more towards the modern assumption that we prize intellectualism more so than I think is warranted. If we agree with the Bible that we serve a God who is deeply interested in knowing us and deeply interested in being known, and that knowing cannot possibly be simply the accumulation of knowledge, then it suggests that there's an awakening, there's an attunement, there's a heart linkage, there's an awareness that is certainly aided and helped by information, but that is far more relational than information. If that makes sense.
It does, and to me it helps reframe it because in the sense of depth that we normally think of it, it would imply just more of what you're doing, right? Just go deeper with where you are. If you're swimming in this direction, just swim farther down, and that's going to take you to be a deep disciple. Just more of the same. And I think what we've been exploring over the past couple of years is that maybe that kind of depth can't be reached in the same way that many of us have been, the direction many of us have been swimming, which is the accumulation of knowledge. It is this kind of factual grounding rather than through relationship. And that kind of brings us, I guess, to the second word in deep community, which is community. In the last episode, Brian, you didn't give a specific and direct definition, but you said overwhelmingly the most effective ecosystem for slow, compassionate spiritual formation is a small, long-term, committed group of people who want the same thing. That seemed as good as any a starting point to me for a definition of community. Is this along the lines of what you mean when you use that word, when you use the term community? And Kyle, you as well?
So it's interesting that the word knowledge, like I think there's all different kinds of knowledge, right? I mean, when we hear that word, I immediately think of, it's somebody that's very intelligent or somebody that knows a lot or is an expert in a certain area. But I think the knowledge that we want is knowledge of self, knowledge of God, knowledge of, all the things that we've been talking about. So I think there's a vulnerability that you have to have. And if the other people in this group, whatever it is, don't share that, it's going to become evident pretty quick. And I think that the amount of depth that you can reach is going to be stifled because they're not all thinking the same thing. They're not all on the same page. Maybe somebody just wanted kind of a social club and they don't want to go into stuff about, well, who am I? No, I thought we were going to just read a couple of verses and, just kind of check off the box or whatever. And then there's other people that might get frustrated because this isn't deep enough. So, yeah, I mean, the thing that resonated with me was everybody has to be kind of on the same page and know what they want and be willing to enter into that with these other people.
Kyle and I had a funny experience a couple of weeks ago. So Kyle and his wife, Michelle, and Jessica and is my wife, we're all in the same greenhouse. And our greenhouse just started, is it season 3 or 4?
4.
for the Forgotten Kingdom.
Mhm.
And so this is the first time they've heard Kyle and I on the podcast together, because the first several seasons I did by myself. And the one is a wonderful man in our group said, if I didn't know you guys, I didn't think you'd like each other.
Well, and then somebody else said, one of the other members of our group said, Brian, you're just really mean to Kyle.
Yeah, right.
You're just
right.
really mean to him.
So I bring that up to say, I've tried to tone my sarcasm down and my teasing of Kyle, but that's the way that I express affection and love a lot. Like in my marriage, like my wife and I are routinely giving each other a hard time about all sorts of different things, but the heart behind it is affectionate and whatnot. So,
And that's how I see it. Yeah.
yeah, but you wouldn't know that unless we were in community and developed a trusted relationship to where that sort of joking can happen. Obviously, if I'm in a relationship with somebody who's more sensitive or I don't know as well, I'm not going to tease them as much as I tease Kyle. But my point is, that's formative. Like that, there's a comfort level, there's an affection that sort of transcends what I know about Kyle. I have experienced Kyle enough to know that it's a safe place for us to express our idiosyncrasies and our sarcasm in a way that is healthy. And I think that type of community is lacking. I mean, study after study after study shows that we are a lonely and increasingly lonely society. And I just sit there and say, shouldn't the Christian church be the exemplar for the opposite of that? I mean, why is there such thing as a lonely believer? And I think for the most part, we have accepted a definition of church which is very event driven and very one sided. We go and receive worship, we go and receive a sermon, and for the most part can be very non participatory, to where the types of relationships where vulnerability and intimacy can be expressed just don't form, or to be honest, that we lack the maturity to be able to handle those because we haven't been taught or trained how to live in those types of communities. And so by nature they have to be small. You cannot be vulnerable in a group of 150 people. You can attend corporate worship with a group of 150 people, and there's certainly value in that. But I think I did an episode back in season 3 called the sitcom community.
Mm-hmm.
We all long, our hearts all long for the types of communities that we see on sitcoms. The same people every week doing life together, being zany together, forgiving quickly, cheers. Everybody knows your name. We all long for that. Why shouldn't the Christian community be the one that actually does it and doesn't tolerate anything less than that?
And I look at my friendship with you guys and how much more comfortable and familiar we are after the amount of time that we've spent together. And, it's grown exponentially. And some of that, too, has been being intentionally vulnerable. I mean, we have been intentional about sharing with each other and discussing deep things and things of the heart, both on air and off. And that time and that intentional vulnerability have certainly borne fruit in our relationships and our friendships. So we talked about what we mean by deep, and we talked about what we mean by community. And we're talking now about what we mean by deep community. I think you're talking about time as one of those. And of course, the other 4 elements of formation weigh in as well. But what would you say are some of the things that characterize deep community? And what is its fruit? How can we tell if we are in a deep community? How do we know it when we see it? How can our listeners better identify what to be looking for to try to find that kind of community in their own lives?
Well, if we were to tie your question into the 3 primary problems that we've explored for 2.5 years, we have the discipleship dilemma, right? The discipleship dilemma says that our capacity to grow to love God more and to love self, others, and creation more is interrelated and interdependent on our willingness and capacity to know ourselves. So in a community, in a small, intentionally formative community, there has to be space and encouragement to explore self in the context of our relationship with God. And this is where, I have a deep appreciation for small groups and for Bible studies, but at least the vast majority of those experiences that I've had are based on accumulating or learning information, and with virtually no space to encourage or explore self in that context. So a true community, a small community, must provide a safe environment where we are free to go back into our stories, to look at our sin patterns, to be confessional, to rejoice and celebrate our talents and our gifts and our relationships, to wrestle and debate and doubt and dissent for the purpose of increasing our capacity to love. Otherwise, there's other wonderful community experiences, don't get me wrong. I mean, to be in a club with somebody or a bowling league, I mean, those all things are great. And they're all formative. I mean, we're constantly being formed. But to be with a group of people, whether they're currently following Jesus or not yet following Jesus, who intentionally want to become more like him, there's a different flavor, there's a different intentionality to it. And I think central to that is a place where we are going to get to know ourselves in the context of getting to know Jesus.
We've talked a lot about all the words in the Bible and how they apply to Christ and his kingdom. Restore, renew, redeem. And this is more a comment than a question, but there's also a scriptural emphasis I've seen on the com words from a Latin prefix com, meaning with or together. And you start looking for them, the Great Commission, Holy Communion, God's compassion, even the 10 Commandments. Commission, we have a shared mission together. Communion is sharing in common. The commandments might seem like a divergence, but they're about relationships between ourselves or with God. That withness is again built into the meaning and the word itself. So commandments are about seeking righteousness together. And of course, compassion meaning to suffer with. It's the first word that God used to describe his character in the Bible. In Exodus 34:6 is compassionate. And of course, community, from com, Latin meaning with, and munus, which can mean either an obligation or duty, but it can also mean, I found out, a gift. So community literally means the duty and gift of being with.
Wow.
So we have a God who could be aloof up on Mount Olympus like Zeus in Greek mythology. He could be cold and distant, running the show on his own. But instead, miraculously, he invites us into the story, to participate, to lead, to be sons and daughters of the King, to rule and reign with him, to be co-heirs with Christ. And a big part of that is meant to be with each other, and it's built into many of the most important words in Scripture. So we have commandments and communion, compassion and commission, while living in community. Does that resonate with either of you guys?
Yeah, it absolutely does. And it goes back to the work with the willing, right? Brian's mentioned that several times. And I think this is where the Holy Spirit comes in. When you get into these communities, or you're trying to form this, or you're trying to establish this, there is, like, Brian, you said it, there's a different flavor there. When there are people that are actively seeking Jesus, it's different. It's just there's an unspoken, unwritten language that is there, even if we don't understand it. It's just there's a commonality there that we want to explore together. And some people aren't ready for that, and that's okay. But yeah, to be able to enter into this, and I had no idea. This is why, Tim, you're masterful at doing this kind of stuff. When you break down a word like that, I had no idea that community was a gift. And that's so true. And so many times in my life, I've seen that word community. Sometimes it leaves a bad taste in my mouth because of the experiences that Michelle and I have had, and the experiences that I've had.
I think there's some tension in definitions that we live in, at least in this part of the world, that impact us experiencing the gift of community. And I'll articulate one of these, and hopefully I can do it in a way that makes sense. Most of the time when I speak to a pastor or a church leader about discipleship, the assumption is that word means reaching somebody who doesn't yet know Jesus, getting them into a church, and educating them. So the small group effort or small communities, in many cases, are designed to invite people who don't yet know Jesus. And if that's not happening, we failed and the groups need to split. So I think I've told this story before, but I was meeting with a local pastor and their quote unquote discipleship groups ended at 6 months. Well, we've been in a greenhouse for almost 2 years and we're just now getting to know each other and cultivating an environment of safety where we're growing together. It's not that there hasn't been formation along the way, but if you were to attend one of our greenhouse gatherings now versus only 6 months in, it's a radically different community. Same people, different community. So then you have this whole guilt factor, like, wait a minute, we have nobody in our group that doesn't know Jesus. Like, are we evangelizing? Are we truly making disciples? And I think that pressure, that tension, that if we are not discipling people who don't yet know Jesus, that's the only way through which we evaluate the Christian life. Establishing true community is going to be hard. Not that those people don't need to be reached, but I've argued this before. I don't think when Jesus said, "Go make disciples," that was exclusive to people that weren't yet following him. That's part of my point about this entire experience, is that we are accepting a shallow version of Christianity and not making disciples of the people already sitting in church. First, there's a lot of lost people sitting in church, a lot of lost people sitting in churches, but I would argue that the deeper we grow, the more attuned we are to Jesus, to ourselves and others. Actually, our evangelism, if we want to call it that, is that much more effective. So if we're going to feel guilty because we're in a small group for longer than a year and we're not, accosting strangers on the street, telling them the personal plan of salvation, it's going to be really hard inside to form long-term, small, formative community. We're going to just feel ashamed that we're doing it.
It certainly is swimming upstream against the established ethos of many churches, maybe most churches. And so I think it goes back to what you were speaking of in the previous episode, that we look to Christ as our model in all things, right? Did he spend all of his time on the road finding people who had never heard of him before and making sure that he declared that he was God's son? Unequivocally, no. He spent an enormous amount of time with a small group of people, building relationships, teaching them. He chose to whom he revealed himself. He was very intentional in every single interaction and seemed to understand that every interaction required a unique individual touch, because he and his Father had created each of those people individually and uniquely, and so he would relate to them differently depending on where their hearts were. And as you said, he's incredibly attuned to each person he meets. And of course, we can never reach that level of attunement, but just as we strive for perfection, if we are going to strive to be like Christ, that means if we evaluate the worthiness of an endeavor, let it not be based on what we feel or we've been told is the right thing. Let it be based on what Christ has modeled. And he modeled the kind of formative community and deep discipleship that we're discussing here. And that's hard to find. And it's scary and it's challenging and it's raw. And it's where real change happens. I mean, I think you can also ask, is this bearing fruit? You can look at these groups if you've been meeting for years and no fruit, no change is happening, no one's opening up, nobody's becoming more like Christ. But I'll turn it to you guys with that. What fruit have you personally seen from being in one of these small formative communities, this greenhouse? What are the impacts that you've seen? Have there been effects in your own faith, in your journey, and how you relate to your family or to others? What have you seen in that regard?
Brian, you just said that, these communities are usually formed with the understanding that our job is to go and reach other people, and we're supposed to bring in or expose the gospel to non-believers. And I'm seeing that the reverse is true, because Tim, after being in the greenhouse for almost 2 years now, I am, I think, finally understanding the kind of disciple that God created me to be. And I'm so much more comfortable being able to allow him to speak through me to other people, if that makes sense. So I always felt a longing to share Jesus with other people. I didn't know how. And I never felt comfortable knocking on doors. I never felt comfortable standing on a street corner. I never felt comfortable walking up to a stranger and doing that. And I always felt guilty. Like, well, what's wrong with me? Why can I not do that? What's deficient in me? Why am I not as close to God as I think? Am I not as knowledgeable because I don't know what to say to people like that? And so, but after being in the greenhouse and just digging deeper into who I am in the relationship with God and relationship with Jesus and the Holy Spirit. I mean, I've been in situations where if you had told me that I would be praying for this stranger or that I would be talking in this way, I'd be like, you're crazy. There's no way I can't do that. And so being immersed in this kind of community, to have this sort of freedom and this safety to explore myself, and then to hear other believers, other people that are struggling with similar things, or they've got their struggles, and to be able to hear that and see how the Holy Spirit is working, it's formed me in ways that I now feel confident and just know, you know what, I'm not looking for this. I'm not going out every day going, okay, who am I going to talk to about Jesus? But I'm so more willing to, if when the Holy Spirit nudges me, be like, oh, okay, just go and do this, or go and take the sleep, or or do whatever it is, however that looks. And there's also freedom to be like, I don't have to think, who did I talk to about Jesus today? Because I'm learning that because of how I interact with people and how I treat people and how I handle certain situations, Jesus is working through that. And it's not about me. It's not about what I do. It's about how he is able to work through me in these interactions and in these other things. So it's been incredibly, incredibly impactful and formative for me.
Jesus exemplifies for me a relational wisdom that I find staggering. He doesn't heal anybody the same way. He addresses different people. He treats the narcissist in one way. He treats the downtrodden in another. Like, there's no system. We love our systems. We love our scripts. We love our programs, and I love those things too. But when you study him in the four Gospels, he's really, really hard to pin down, in the best sense of that phrase. So for me, the greenhouse and coming together for several hours a week to be intentionally formed more like Jesus has, I think, allowed me to slowly, maybe too slowly, become more attuned to God and myself and certainly others and creation. And that formation has absolutely resulted in increasing my capacity to love, but also my capacity to discern hearts better. So to Kyle's point, there are times where I'm pretty sure that God is gently nudging me to share Jesus and the plan of salvation with somebody. But there are other times where the Spirit is saying that is the last thing you should be doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really hard for Western Christians to hear. That, wait a second, is there a time where I'm supposed to share the truth. I'm supposed to share the gospel. And again, when you look at Jesus, it's not what he does. Sometimes he heals people. Sometimes he gets on people's cases. Sometimes he chides them. Sometimes he gets frustrated with them. Sometimes he restores them. Sometimes he forgives them. Sometimes he says, follow me. But there's an extraordinary attunement that he has with the Father that allows him to navigate relationships in a way that I think is extraordinary and kingdom building. And I think in all 8 cases, maybe Kyle would disagree, but I have seen visible evidence of depth in every single person that's in the greenhouse. And I think they would all say that. I think they would all agree with that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
More so than what they've experienced in other environments.
So we've talked about what we mean by deep community, and we've talked about the benefits and fruit that have been experienced through deep community. And Brian, in the last episode, you unpacked how you really have not received much pushback in identifying the problems themselves that Soil and Roots over the last couple of years has been exploring that plaguing Western Christianity. The majority of people acknowledge that these problems exist: the great omission, the overemphasis on conversion, the lack of truly deep spiritual formation and discipleship at a systematic level. And if we can agree that these kinds of deep, small, formative communities that we're discussing do not really exist in the traditional Western institutional systems and structures that we see in the majority of our local churches, we might expect for there to be a huge wave of people pursuing these kind of small, intentional, deep communities outside of their institutional church bodies. But it seems that for most, that's a bridge too far. So maybe we can talk for a few minutes about what some of the obstacles or potential culprits might be, keeping maybe even some of our listeners back from that, despite a longing to find this kind of community and to reach this kind of deep discipleship. We could go through the list of prosperity and the busy pace and the air we breathe and all those things, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. Can we talk some about some of the obstacles, and then maybe we can dig into some ways to encourage people to overcome them?
Well, this is the question that I've wrestled with for 3 years, and I'm not sure I've come to any meaningful. I mean, all the things that you've mentioned are factors: prosperity, frantic paces, the American dream, which has its positives, obviously, but also has its negatives. But I think probably one of the most powerful forces working against small formative communities is the church structure itself. And I've taken some heat for claiming that. I'm not alone, but I would say it even if I was. And again, it's not to say that there's nothing good or ministerial or formative about the way that the modern church structure has formed. But we have to deal authentically with the ideas that are driving it. Reality is that most people who go to a church, Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, I wouldn't say most, I don't know that, but many people who go to those churches live under the assumption that as long as they take a sacrament or hear a good sermon that they think agrees with Scripture, that they're good. And then that gets segmented from the rest of their lives. And to be honest, the church institution has gone right along with that. They have. As long as the offering basket is full and they can pay for their buildings and their staff and their programs, then they are content to provide good, solid biblical teaching in the way that they define it and opportunities for people to serve. And they put virtually no thought into character formation. The reality is that character formation today, for the most part, is reserved primarily for the addicts and the people who are quote-unquote really screwed up and are either in a recovery program or they're in counseling. That's really one of the only settings in which we even expect to have our deep character formed. Church is where we go to learn, where we go to serve, and where we go to sort of check the box. But we have like 50, 75, 100 years of that. I mean, that's not something you overcome overnight. I mean, you can imagine if somebody loves their church and loves their pastor, and we should love our churches and pastors, so they're saying, wait a second, are you saying that I'm missing out on genuine discipleship, but my church is blah? It's just a hard conversation to have because we obviously have deep emotional attachments. And there is good things happening. I'm simply saying that, and I'm repeating myself from last episode, if the modern church is great at stages 1, 2, and 3, 4, 5, and 6 isn't happening, what do we do with that reality? We celebrate 1, 2, and 3. We celebrate how well it's being guided and facilitated in modern church institutions. But there's a reason why there's thousands and thousands of people who are checking out of church and saying, this just isn't, it's not formative, it's not helpful. I've been there, I've done that. I've, unfortunately or unfortunately, I get a lot of stories of people that have experienced extraordinary church hurt. And usually it's because the institution itself is set up in a power structure that doesn't actually serve the individual person. And unless we're willing to say, what do we do with that? It's going to be difficult to convince somebody that there's more to the Christian life, but it requires an adaptation of what we consider community to be in order to experience it.
Do you guys also think there's a strong stigma with thinking that my formation should come from outside the church? Because, like to what you were saying, Brian, I mean, there's nothing wrong with going to church. There's nothing wrong with listening to a pastor. There's nothing wrong with being in a community group or whatever. But if you're not growing closer to Jesus through that, then to ask those questions of, okay, well, what do I need to do? What is missing? What do I need to add to this? If that overreaching idea of that, the formation of individual hearts is not happening in the institutional church, but there are some other great things that are happening. I think there might be like some guilt and shame with, well, if I think my church isn't doing that, then I can't think that, because that's where God is, and that's holy, and it's His dwelling place. So if it's not happening there, then I'm not going to admit to that. I'm not going to say that I'm not getting formed at my church, because that just seems heretical.
And I think that because we have such deep attachment and affection for, well-deserved, and love and respect for our churches and the people there, it does make these conversations harder to have. We worry about hurting feelings. We worry about damaging relationships. We love our churches and our pastors, and we should. And yet, if we want to be deep disciples, and we are in stages 4, 5, and 6, and we are wanting to press further into that, that's what do we do with that? So what's the answer to that question? And of course, that's an incredibly slippery question. Can we begin to have these conversations at our churches? Where to begin? How can we help our churches to grow smaller, to pare down those power structures? For those listening or watching that are resonating with what we're saying, and maybe asking themselves, what do we do with that? Do we have any advice for action steps? Obviously, listening and reading and talking to others, praying about this, but where do we go from here?
Well, if you recall the conversation I relayed last episode with my pastor friend in Georgia, he said, as you contemplate having more greenhouses or other groups have more small, intentionally formative communities, don't go to the institutional church. Trying to convince the existing power structures to divest authority or empower folks in smaller communities, or to share story, or even the term spiritual formation, which is offensive to some Christians. Like, that's not where you should go. You should go to the nuns and duns. Go to the people who don't know Jesus but are curious about him, and go to the folks who, for whatever reason, have checked out of the institutional churches. Because to try to argue for small formative communities in institutions that are trying to grow numbers and influence, you're in a power struggle. Now, that's not to say, I think there are tons of pastors and priests who resonate with spiritual formation and would love to see small, spiritually formative communities inside their church. And they're typically going to say, oh, that's my small group ministry. Well, in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. At the same time, when we're talking about small formative communities, that means that the authority structure, the power, if you will, is in that group. And there's not much else. And that there's no celebrity pastor. There's no kingpin who tells you what to think. We wrestle and explore and doubt and dissent together. It's a very different culture altogether than what most churches experience. And I think if there are pastors and priests and churches who legitimately want to build a network of small formative communities inside their institution, go for it. That'd be awesome. But before that happens, there's probably some hard thinking that has to happen, and asking questions like, well, what is this going to do to the power, the structure, the governance? Am I comfortable with somebody disagreeing with my sermon? Am I comfortable with somebody doubting and dissenting a statement of faith from my doctrine? Am I okay with people spending 45 minutes or an hour sharing their stories and trying to explore that with other people, and there's no Bible verse mentioned? Like, those types of questions should be asked. And, I certainly think it's possible, but the cultural assumptions of a small formative community are usually very, very, very different than the institutional church.
And it's kind of a catch-22 right now, in that so long as this kind of community is little known or little pursued, kind of on the fringes, that it's challenging to even find others who are seeking it out or would be open to it. But this kind of deep community requires fellow travelers, right? Community can't be found solo. I speak from experience and kind of wrestle with this. So, it's also, what about those who struggle to find others willing to go on this journey, to form these kind of groups? And hearing you, Kyle, that's a large part of what we want to be a resource for. People can reach out to us, right, Brian? Kyle, they can come to us with questions. They can email you. They can get resources off of the website, and we can try to encourage and guide as much as we can through that process of forming a greenhouse for those that are interested in doing that. And for anyone, we would just encourage that kind of openness to pursuing this kind of community. And we're living proof of the fruit that can result from that.
Well, I mean, our vision, if God so designs, is to have a worldwide network of small, intentionally formative communities. And my pastor friend from Georgia said, I completely resonate with you. Good luck. Because it's going to be really hard. So he was very honest with me. And this is coming from a pastor who knows the megachurch and the small church culture very, very well. He said, I think any attempts to disciple in groups of more than 12 isn't going to work. And so the structure that you set up and the culture that you're creating is right on. But you are attempting to append or reform or fit into the context of the modern church institution. And he said, I think there are millions and millions and millions of people who are already aware and deeply desire the type of formation that you are advocating. But getting to them, spreading the message, helping them determine how that fits into the context of their local church, he said, is an enormous uphill climb. He said, it's just going to be difficult. I support it. I endorse it. So his argument was, oh, no, there's no lack of people. He said, the issue is not that they're not out there. The issue is how do we reach them in a way that's winsome and informative and encourages them to be honest, take the risk of being vulnerable and intimate in small communities.
We're talking about these challenges, and I think another one that is there for many people is resistance to change and fear of the unknown. I've certainly struggled with that myself. We're talking about being people of depth and deep discipleship, deep communities, but the deep is frightening, right? It's vulnerable, it's wild. So there's a fear of going into the deep, fear that we will be in too deep, like Phil Collins in Genesis. But the deep is scary, right?
Yes. So
I kind of wanted to segue from there, Brian, into the sign-off that you often use on your emails and other writings. You frequently end with Duc and Altum, which is a Latin phrase. And I'll actually, if you don't mind, if you could kind of share a little bit more about the story, I think it's Luke 5, and where that comes from and what that means to you. And we can talk about that a little bit, what it means to us to go into the deep with God.
Well, the phrase has typically applied in Catholic settings, and I'm a lifelong Protestant, but I find a lot of Catholic literature to be extremely helpful and formative. And this, to me, is a phrase that you rarely see in Protestant circumstances, but it's based on Luke 5:4, where Jesus tells Peter to put out into the deep and lower his nets for the catch, and then Peter hauls in so many fish that it threatens to sink the boat. And the idea behind the phrase is deep calls to deep. As we humble ourselves and become willing to explore the depths of God in our own hearts and the hearts of other people, that we experience God in a way that we hadn't before. And I'm not necessarily talking about ecstatic visions or miracles, although sometimes those things happen. It's more of relationally, we become engulfed in the best sense of the word in the love and the compassion and the grace of God. And that begins to transform the way that we relate to other people. And so for me, this is not just deep thinking. It's not just sitting around having coffee house conversations that are theologically deep. It is following Christ's command to take the risk, even when it seems goofy or silly, to respond to his call, to experience him in ways that maybe we weren't used to before. And that means that we're doing things that maybe we didn't do before. It's been said by a number of the folks in our greenhouse, hey, I didn't really know what I was getting into when you set this thing up. And to be honest, I wasn't all that excited about it. It took 3 or 4 months to where my heart said, oh, this is what we're doing. And I think that's a perfect expression of what Jesus is asking Peter to do, which is that sometimes if we recognize there's a yearning for a deeper experience with God, if there's a yearning to be more relationally shrewd, if there's a longing to feel more attached to Jesus and others, that it might take us switching the nets to the other side of the boat and allowing ourselves for those nets to be filled in abundance.
God is such a master storyteller, and as a creative writing and literature person, I always appreciate the symbolism and the themes that are woven through the Bible. The deep in that time and place represented death. It represented something that was feared and unknown. Whether when the disciples are sailing across the lake and the storm is blown up and they're threatened to sink, or just discussions of going down into the deep, it was symbolic of death, and death likewise was symbolic of change and rebirth. And so we have this place that Jesus is telling Peter to go out to. He's saying, go somewhere that might be scary to you. Go somewhere that you don't know exactly what's going to be happening, what might come through on the other side. Change is always scary. Change is always hard. Change is almost always painful. But that kind of transformation is necessary for us to be turned into something different from what we already were. And so, to me, that's what it means to put out into the deep. It means to sacrifice my ideas of safety and security and comfort and to go on this adventure with God and be willing to be transformed, which is scary, but is worth it. Kyle, what does it mean to you to put out into the deep with Jesus?
It's very similar to what you guys are talking about. And Peter was a fisherman. He knew how to go into the depths. He knew how to do this. So it's not like Jesus was telling him to do something like go fly a plane. And I know that that's a ridiculous metaphor to use, but it was something that he knew. But at the same time, it's like, wait a minute, I've already done this. I've done this before. What's gonna? And it's just that no, but you haven't done it with me. And so to be able to let go of some of the preconceived notions that I've already had about certain things, or the thought patterns that I've created and the paths that I have beaten down in my brain and in my heart, and allow Jesus to direct me into somewhere else. And it is going to be hard, and it is going to be scary, and it is going to be confusing at times. But I know he's with me.
Tim, I thought I would close with some lyrics from one of my all-time favorite songs, probably one of my top 5 favorite songs. And it's old. It's written by a group called Out of the Gray, which was a husband and wife team, but I don't think they record anymore. And they wrote a song called The Deep. And I won't read all the lyrics, I'll just read the second half of the song, but it so beautifully describes what you've led us through today. I am a wave upon the sea. Someday soon the tide will take me deeper underneath, where the wind cannot break me. I'll be sinking in the flood, completely taken by his love. Oh, I can hear the deep calling out to me. It's a siren song of peace. And I long to be swallowed up and swept into the deep. And to the people who are stranded on the land, I'm reaching out my hand. Can you hear the deep calling you to sea? It's a siren song of peace, and don't you long to be swallowed up and swept into the deep? Come follow me, be swallowed by the deep.
Mm.
And with that, we thank you for joining us on this journey into deep discipleship here in season 5. We think this is the end of the season, but we'll see. Maybe if some of the guests I reached out to respond to my calls and emails in December, I'll bring them on in January. But we'd love to, make you think like this is all wrapped up tight and we're all ship-shape, but sometimes we're just winging it. And there's Kyle's yet unpacked house.
Yeah.
If you're on video.
This year.
So thanks for tuning in. And we already gave you all the social stuff. Again, if you'd like to reach out to us, you can reach us at fish@soilandroots.org. Yes, we do check our emails. Yes, we do respond to the emails. Yes, we are real people. This podcast is produced in-house here at Fish Tank Studios, primarily by Zach Fisher, if you recognize his last name. He's one of my sons. He also writes and produces the music for the podcast. Just came out with a new album. You can check it out. You can find him at FishU, FISSHU on Spotify. Thanks so much for being with us, and we'll see you next time.